For hundreds of years, the people of Rome were not allowed to construct a permanent theater. Despite a flourishing theatrical tradition, with festivals that included dramatic performances held multiple times each year, and while other cities around the Mediterranean were constructing lavish monuments to drama, the Romans painstakingly constructed temporary stages again and again, and made audiences sit on temple steps or hillsides, or even stand to watch. It was only in 55 BC, 300 years after the first performances in Rome, that the city finally got a permanent theater. Why were these theaters forbidden for so long? There's two answers to that question. The first is the one the Romans love to complain about, but the second is the one that clearly really scared them. According to the historian Livy, the grand tradition of Roman drama began in the middle of the 4th century BC. This was a difficult time to be a Roman. They had ongoing conflicts with neighboring cities and weathered a disastrous attack from the Gauls, who sacked Rome. Recovering and rebuilding was difficult, and in the middle of that chaos, the year 364 BC brought a plague. Now, before I tell you about the plague, first I need to tell you a little bit about Livy. His History of Rome is an essential source on the Republican period, but it wasn't written in a vacuum. Livy was writing at the end of the 1st century BC, in the wake of a violent civil war that killed the Republic. This was a traumatic event. Decades of civil war, chaos in the streets, mass executions. It left Livy with a certain pessimism, and in the introduction to his work, he lays out how his history is about how things have gone to hell in a handbasket. Then let the reader follow in their mind how, as integrity slipped little by little, Roman ways of life first deteriorated, and then how they slipped more and more, then how they began to sprint downhill, until finally we arrive at our own times, in which we can bear neither our vices nor their cures. Once upon a time, everything used to be good. Now everything's bad. History shows why. Enter the plague. A grave pestilentia tore through Rome. The Romans tried the usual measures to appease whatever gods must be causing it, but nothing was working. Now, if you've ever lived through a grave pestilentia affecting your own community, you know that people get really desperate and they get really weird. According to Livy, the Romans did the weirdest thing one could possibly do. And when the violence of the disease was soothed by neither human measures nor divine might, and as the people's minds were conquered by superstition, it's said that, among the other means of pacifying divine wrath, the Romans even arranged theatrical performances, something unheard of for a nation of warriors who had previously had only the chariot races at the Circus Maximus as entertainment. Amongst other things, this passage demonstrates what state-sanctioned theater looked like. It was condoned in a religious context and considered a form of worship. The gods of Rome apparently enjoyed a good skit. Livy, on the other hand, hates skits with a fiery passion. Theater is part of his narrative of how things have degraded over time. The Romans used to be a warlike people, humble butchers who only liked chariot racing before theater got its decadent mitts on them. Theater is how the Roman way of life began to slip little by little. And in case you didn't catch that subtle subtext, Livy also lays it out explicitly. He really wants you to know that theater was not a good idea. The earliest origin of theater seems to me like it should be placed among the small beginnings of other institutions, so that it's clear how it has come from a sane beginning to this insanity of the present day that could scarcely be tolerated by decadent royalty. Livy himself was born just as the first permanent theater was being constructed in Rome, something that changed the way the Eternal City operated forever. That surely must have inflected his thinking, but we'll come back to that later. For now, let's consider more of his criticism. He stresses that theater isn't Roman. These first performers were Etruscans from northern Italy. This is a peregriner race, a foreign thing. Even though, by the time he was writing, theater had been part of a Roman tradition for more than 300 years. It's still cast as this external thing, and that's a very traditional Roman perspective. Anything you don't like is a foreign force corrupting true Roman traditions and mores. For him, the corruption comes in the form of Roman citizens copying the performers. Young men started to imitate the actors, making fun of each other with rude verses, and their gestures matched their words. I don't know about you, but for me this sounds very familiar. How many of us have had friends, or been the friend, be honest, who have repeated their favorite bits from a movie or stand-up comedy or a meme or something like that? You've got the gestures down, and they do it again and again ad nauseum. Is it annoying, especially when they do it over and over? Yeah, 1000%. Is it a sign of the imminent collapse of society? For Livy, yes.
And Livy wouldn't have been the only one to think this way. The issue for Romans like him is acting like an actor. Actors in ancient Rome were considered infamous, literally without reputation. Being an actor, was the thinking, meant that you did not deserve to be treated like a normal human being. Actors couldn't testify in court, they couldn't marry certain classes, they could be more or less abused with impunity. Even the most popular actors, the celebrities of ancient Rome, were always considered worthy of contempt, always considered less than a normal human being. If you're interested in actors and this concept of infamia, I've got a video about a famous Roman actress that covers this a lot more, so I'll link that below. This issue with actors is certainly what the Romans would like you to believe is the main reason that there was no permanent theater. Of course, they would tell you, of course they're not building a permanent theater, an immortal shrine to these lowly scum and their corrupting influence on the youth of Rome. No, no true Roman, no stalwart citizen of the Republic is ever going to want that. Except, of course, for the ones that did. In the 2nd century BC, people tried to construct permanent theaters in Rome at least 3 times, so 3 times that we know of. The first attempt was in 179, when the censors Aemilius Lepidus and Fulvius Nobilior let a contract for a theater and stage at the Temple of Apollo. The second attempt was only a few years later, in 174, when the censors Fulvius Flaccus and Postumius Albinus let a contract for a theater to be offered to the aediles and praetors, so made available for the government officials who frequently sponsored these shows. Neither of these theaters is ever mentioned again. All we have are these contracts. But, as several historians have pointed out, these would have had to be significant contracts in order for them to make their way into Livy's history. These were serious attempts. They were also respectful ones. The first theater is associated with religion, it's at the temple to Apollo, and as we all know, theater associated with religion is the most kosher way to have theater. The second one is explicitly in the service of the state, to make it easier for the government officials who are putting on these shows. These attempts were also initiated by censors, the most respected officials in Rome, kind of by definition. Censors' whole job was to preserve Roman morality. If they saw people doing something they considered un-Roman, it was on them to stop it. So these are the people who are looking at theaters and saying, you know what, yeah, I think it's actually a good idea for Rome to have a permanent theater. So these were not unserious or external or renegade attempts to have theaters. These were coming from the most respected people in Rome, and they were done in ways that were in accordance with what Romans considered an acceptable way to have theater. But someone must have censored them, because these projects stopped dead in their tracks. The snuffing of these projects is mysterious, but we have more information about the motive and context for the third attempt, which came 20 years later, in 154. That's when the censors Cassius Longinus and Valerius Massala began the construction of a permanent theater. But 3 years later, in 151, the project is halted. The theater, which was already underway, was under construction, was torn down. And the order to do so came from a senatorial decree, which was backed by one of Rome's consuls. And that means that the most powerful people in Rome were desperate to shut this project down. Why? Depends who you ask. If you ask Livy, it was that the city and its leaders realized that the theater was harmful to the public character for all the reasons that he's discussed before, and people behaving like actors, inevitable downfall of society, yada yada yada. Velleius Paterculus, a historian writing about a generation after Livy and similarly looking back centuries to talk about this, praises the city's extraordinary sobriety. That was what shut the theater down, he says. Valerius Maximus, a contemporary of Velleius Paterculus, goes even further. He points out that the Senate also passed a decree forbidding anyone to even sit down at a performance at this time, and not just in the city of Rome, but up to a mile outside the city. They were that dead set against this foreign decadence. You can't even sit. They did this, he says, in order to preserve the manliness of the Roman people. Once upon a time, the Romans were so macho that even sitting was too girly for them. I'm trying to bring out the sense of nostalgia in these anecdotes. All of these guys are writing centuries afterwards, and they're looking back on these halcyon days of the Republic when theaters got shut down. Tacitus, another historian who covers this period, who's writing almost 300 years after this failed theater, longs for the days of the Republic when people weren't allowed to sit around and watch a show. Those were the days, he says, when people understood that citizens shouldn't be allowed to just spend whole days in idleness. Pliny the Elder is writing around the same period, and he's collecting little anecdotes for his natural history. He compares the imperial reign of Augustus, who put up an awning over a certain section of the forum so that people could do their business in the shade, with the gritty days of the Republic, when Cato the Elder, very famous Republican hero, wanted the Forum to be paved with sharp stones, so people wouldn't even stand around, so it was uncomfortable even to stand for too long. That's how dedicated they were to preventing laziness in the Roman character. All in all, you get a picture of a moralizing stance against theaters, or at the very least, a nostalgia for a past people envision when there was this moralizing stance against theaters, when the stalwarts of the Republic bravely held the line against encroaching foreign decadence. Their collective rationale is that a permanent theater would encourage idleness. It would encourage this passivity that was already very un-Roman, and it would allow you to be corrupted by actors, who we all know are terrible, so that you just start repeating whatever nonsense they say, and you even, they corrupt you down to your gestures. A permanent theater would have codified this idleness, would have encouraged it on the institutional level, and all in all, you're encouraging this foreign, un-Roman tradition. This rationale is also what scholars have historically put down for why the Romans rejected the idea of a stone theater for so long. It was this cultural animus against what they considered to be foreign laziness. But there are hints that this is not the full picture. Take the historian Appian. He's writing about a generation after Tacitus. He does start by saying that the theater was probably shut down in order to prevent what the Romans considered to be Greek decadence. But he also gives another reason for why this theater might have been shut down. A reason no one else mentions, and that casts everything in a very different light. A reason we will get to in a bit. First, we have to talk about what was happening in the Republic. If the Romans weren't constructing a permanent theater, what were they doing for theatrical performances? In brief, the most. Despite all the hand-wringing about morality and decadence, the Romans invested in theater constantly, more and more as the years went on. By the mid-3rd century, we've got plays being performed in Rome. By the end of that century, business is booming. That's when we get Titus Maccius Plautus, one of Rome's most famous playwrights, and he was not writing dignified, serious tragedies. He was writing stupid comedy. They were incredibly popular. His audience was the entire city of Rome. One of his plays actually begins with some crowd work. So we get a little snapshot of who might have been in the audience. The actor starts by accusing these people of sitting on stage of being sex workers. The joke here is clearly, though, about the fact that they're sitting on stage and what that makes them, rather than the fact that sex workers might show up to a play. That's not an issue. There are also references to bodyguards for powerful people. We've got enslaved people and free people. We've got wet nurses with their babies who are showing up. We've got married women with their husbands. So a whole slice of life here. And we know that the most powerful people in Rome, some of the same people who are trying to shut down these permanent theaters, would also have been in the audience because they insisted on special seating for themselves. In 194 BC, the censors determined that the senatorial order, the most powerful and wealthy people in Rome, should be given the best seats in the house at theatrical performances. So again, the most respected people in Rome didn't just want to watch theater, they wanted to have the best seats. There were also more and more holidays with official state-sanctioned theatrical performances called Ludi Scaenici being added to the religious calendar every year. We've got the plebeian ludi and the ludi to the goddess Ceres in 220, the ludi of Apollo in 212, the ludi for the goddess Magna Mater in 194, and the ludi of the goddess Flora in 173. Most of these were already holidays. They were just being changed to specifically include theatrical performances. And that's 6 state-sanctioned holidays with performances per year. And that's before you factor in individual celebrations and occasions for performance. So you've got insanely popular plays, lots of scheduled performances, and just staggering amounts of money being poured into the construction of these temporary theaters. Valerius Maximus says that for a long time, the panels, the backdrops for these scenes weren't actually painted. But in 99 BC, Clodius Pulcher sponsors painted panels, and apparently they were painted so beautifully, so realistically, that according to Pliny, crows actually tried to land on the painted roof tiles. The extravagance builds throughout the 1st century BC. Gaius Antonius Hybrida covers the whole backdrop with silver, as does Publius Lentulus Spinther. Marcus Petreius uses gold, and Quintus Catulus goes for ivory. Can you imagine watching a play against the glint of gold or silver or ivory? And again, all of this was temporary. It was ephemeral. This was like gilding seafoam. We also see technological innovations. Quintus Catulus is the first to cover the spectator area with an awning in 69 BC, so you could watch the theater in the shade, very civilized. Not only that, they were colorful. These awnings were decked out expensively in brown, yellow, and red. We even hear about the Lucili brothers in the 1st century BC making a movable stage, which is, the word is versatilum, possibly a reference to revolving panels for different sets that allowed for a quick change of scenery if you just moved them a little bit. The poet Lucretius also describes this stage being scented with perfume, specifically saffron from Cilicia, an obscenely expensive spice. And while you were there, he says, you could smell Panchaean scents, that is, scents from Panchaea, this mythical island that was supposed to be east of Arabia, which was filled with heavenly perfume. Going to the theater supposedly smelled so good that it was beyond the scope of the world as you knew it. Behind Lucretius's admittedly artistic license is a comment about how much money is being poured into these temporary constructions. These developments suggest that, yeah, maybe theater was frowned upon, maybe it was associated with spectacle and decadence, but also, apparently the Romans really loved spectacle and decadence. They were willing to spend money on it over and over and over again. So a conservative moralizing can't totally account for this lack of permanent theaters, because the Romans were happy to approve investment in every other aspect of theater except for that, in every other aspect of decadence and performance. There has to be an issue with the structure itself. Let's go back to Appian. One problem with theaters is their association with Greek pleasures. That's a terrifying threat for the Romans, but it would have gone hand in hand with the other problem that Appian lists, which is rebellion. For the Romans of the Republic, theater was associated not just with foreign decadence, but all kinds of upheaval, revolt, treachery, mass execution, and something that they considered even worse than all of that. This association would have come from places like Sicily. The Romans might have heard like Mamercus, the tyrant of Catana. Tyrant, by the way, is just the term for the kind of leader he was. I'm not just calling him a tyrant. Mamercus, the tyrant of Catana, who, after he was defeated by the Greek general Timoleon in 338 BC, was taken to a theater to be tried. Around the same time, Mamercus's ally, Hippo, his name was Hippo, I'm not just calling him a hippo, he was the tyrant of Catana, he was similarly tried and even executed in a theater. And according to the historian Plutarch, this was such a spectacle that kids were taken out of school and brought to the theater to watch. I don't know that that's relevant to this history of construction of theaters, but it is nuts, so I'm including it. This association between theaters and the destruction of the government, it persisted. In 135 BC, so centuries after these tyrants were taken down, when the enslaved people of Anna took over that city, the first thing they did was convene together in a theater, execute the cruelest of the local slave owners, and elect a leader for their rebellion. These reversals of power all took advantage of the fact that the theater was a convenient place for people to gather. In fact, it was associated with that, and that was a use that was particularly associated with the Greeks. In one of his speeches, the Roman orator Cicero rants about how the Greeks are ruled by a mob that sits down to deliberate, and even places them in a theater for that. Greek public affairs are managed by the haphazard will of the sitting assembly. That venerable country, which once flourished with wealth, power, and glory, fell from this one evil, unchecked freedom and the will of the assemblies. When people with no experience, crude and ignorant, sat together in a theater, that's when they started useless wars, that's when they put partisan hacks in charge, that's when they threw the most worthy citizens out of society. That reference to sitting together in a theater is about the fact that by the 1st century BC, when Cicero was writing, the Athenian assembly had moved from their previous meeting place to the theater of Dionysus. So theater was an official tool, not to mention a symbol of not just the people's will, but of the democratic system of government specifically. Knowing that, the xenophobic rhetoric against theaters as this foreign invention starts to take on an additional subtext. Greek decadence might have been an issue for the Roman powers that be, but Greek democracy was a potentially much more ominous one. Now, the Romans were not only aware of this use of theaters, but they apparently even took advantage of it in their dealings with foreign cities. In 214 BC, during the Second Punic War, the Roman commander Lucius Pinarius had been stationed with a garrison at Enna, one of many Sicilian cities that were in an uneasy alliance with the Romans against their enemies, the Carthaginians. When the people of Enna asked that Pinarius return the keys to the gate to the city, claiming that even if they had an alliance with the Romans, they still wanted to be in charge of their own city gates, Pinarius asked for a meeting with the people so that he might know whether this demand came from just a few people or the whole city. An assembly of the people was agreed upon for the next day. On that day, as Livy tells us, as Pinarius came to the theater, some of his men were stationed in different places to block the roads and seal the exits, while the majority of the men took positions above the theater and around it. Pinarius, meanwhile, came out and explained to the assembly that he didn't have the authority to hand over the keys. And little by little,
First a few, then more people, then finally everyone, with one voice, demanded the return of the keys. When Pronarius kept talking delays and postponements, they threatened him viciously and seemed on the verge of a deadly attack. That's when the commander gave the agreed-upon signal with his toga, and the soldiers, who had been ready and eager for a long time, let out a roar and charged. Some down onto the assembly as they fled, some, gathered at the exits of the theater, blocked their escape. The people of Enna, trapped in the seating area of the theater, were slaughtered and fell in heaps, not just from the butchery but also their attempts to escape, as people scrambled onto the heads of others, the unhurt piling up with the wounded, the living falling on the dead. Livy justifies this atrocity as a necessary evil. Without violent intervention, the will of the people of Enna might have prevailed.
In all of these gory anecdotes, the physical space of the theater is key. It's waiting for people to gather there, for things to happen within it. The execution of these tyrants and slave owners would have been very different if they'd had to construct a stage for it. The slaughter at Enna would never have happened if they had just gathered in a convenient open space. Despite the lack of a permanent theater, however, the people of Rome seem to have used temporary spaces as best they could to express their will at theatrical performances. There's a juicy example of this from one of the letters of Cicero written to his friend Atticus in 59 BC. Cicero is lamenting the fact that Pompey the Great, a general and statesman whom he supports, has fallen out of favor with the people. The people's perspective, says Cicero, is especially apparent in the theater and at shows. He describes how a famous actor, Diphilus, has recently delivered some lines that could be taken as a coded criticism of Pompey. Pompey's last name, his cognomen, was the Great, and the line went, "To our misery, you are great." According to Cicero, when Diphilus said this, he was forced by the audience to repeat it 1,000 times. And when Diphilus went on to speak the more threatening line, "There will come a time when you deeply regret that same boldness," Cicero says he's delivered the line to the applause of the whole theater. It really is like the verses were written for the occasion by an enemy of Pompey, Cicero grumbles. If neither laws nor traditions check you, and other stuff was said with howling and applause from the audience. When Julius Caesar came into the theater, Cicero adds, the applause died. This reaction from the audience doesn't seem to have been an isolated incident either. Cicero says that performances are one of the few places where people can express themselves collectively. For when it comes to the Republic, in 3 places can the will and judgment of the Roman people be made especially clear: in the public assembly, at the voting grounds, and by their collective presence at the ludi and gladiator shows. That word for collective presence, konsessu, literally means they're sitting together, like one could at any time in a permanent theater if it was just standing there. Knowing that, the conservative Roman grudge against people sitting down for these performances starts to sound less like fighting the good fight against idleness, and more like a more nuanced worry about what might happen once those people had sat down, especially if they started talking to each other. All in all, the Roman government's resistance to theaters starts to sound less like a worry about what the actors might say, and more of a worry about what the people might say, and not so much a distaste for their idleness as a fear of their agency, and that the Greek pleasure that they feared most was in fact democracy. As Frank Sear in his work on Roman theaters has put it, the Roman Senate, by banning a permanent home for dramatic performances, was probably in fact refusing to create an assembly place for the people, a forum for agitation. Temporary theaters might be extravagantly expensive, but they allowed for these spaces to be used only with total government approval and control every time. The censors' attempts to create theaters might have reflected a confidence about being able to control what went on with these spaces, but it clearly was not shared by the Senate. There always seems to have been a quiet but pervasive fear that if this theater was built, the people sitting in it would start talking to each other, would turn it into a forum for agitation. Knowing all that, you might think, well, Rome did eventually get a permanent theater in 55 BC. Was this an affirmation of the people's right to assemble? Was this a triumph for democracy? No, it was not. It was a triumph for just one man. In 61 BC, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, returned to Rome as probably the happiest guy in Europe. His victory against King Mithridates of Pontus, as well as his success against the pirates of the Mediterranean, had earned him a right to a triumph, a military parade through the city. Pompey's Third. A triumph was a big deal, very rare, and earning not just a second, but a third one was unheard of. Pompey wanted this event to be unforgettable. He started by waiting to make sure that it fell on his birthday, which was September 29th, in case you'd like to celebrate. Then, the parade itself was so extravagant that it stretched to double the normal length for a triumph, 2 days instead of 1. And this would have involved things like the display of captives, spoils of war, and exotic trophies from his campaign. But the jewel in this crown was the enormous public structure that Pompey commissioned to commemorate his victory. It was tradition, by that point, to leave a permanent reminder of your military victories with some sort of monument to your success. So statues, arches, temples, especially a temple to a god who had helped you secure your victory, those were all pretty standard. Pompey's monument was on another order of magnitude. He created an entire complex with a garden at the center with statues and fountains and beautiful trees. That was surrounded by a covered promenade, which was itself a kind of art museum. On one side of the complex was a curia, a meeting space for the Senate, and on the other side was a resplendent theater. This thing was massive. Our only stats for it come from this guide to Rome from the 4th century AD, so many centuries after it was made, called the Regionary Catalogues, which lists its seating as 11,500, which is already quite a lot, but that also might have reflected some degradation of the space over time, and especially if you compare it to similar theaters in the area, that just seems a little bit low, actually. So Frank Sear has put it somewhere more like 15,000. And this theater dominated the landscape so thoroughly for so long that even now, thousands of years later, after it has been built over many times, it still affects the curve of the city streets. You can see the old shape of it here on the Via di Grotta Pinta. On top of the theater, above the cavea, was a temple to Venus Victrix, Venus as the goddess of victory, one final boast of Pompey's success. That idea of boasting is key to understanding how and why Rome finally got a permanent theater. The whole complex was a monument not to the power of the masses, but to Pompey himself, to his personal power. No one had ever built on this scale in the city, and Pompey was also defying tradition and government control with this theater. He was more or less daring anyone to stop him. No one dared. 2 more permanent theaters sprang up quickly afterwards, the Theater of Balbus in 13 BC, and the Theater of Marcellus. Now, this was actually begun by Julius Caesar, Pompey's rival, but construction seems to have been halted in the advent of Julius Caesar's assassination, and it was only completed by Augustus, his adopted son, in 13 BC as well. Augustus was Rome's first emperor. He took power through a violent civil war, and his reign was the death knell for the Republic. That was the destruction of society, by the way, that Livy witnessed. The Republic violently replaced with autocratic rule, and he's clearly processing it as a loss of what he considers national character and way of life. He seems to be blaming the people for their misguided support for this, but to be fair, it was not the people who were building these theaters. The Theater of Marcellus solidified the building of theaters as not just an expression of individual control, but specifically of imperial power. Seating, which if you remember was already mapped onto social hierarchy, began to follow an imperial hierarchy specifically. More laws were added about who could sit where, with the most powerful people again getting the best seats. Between the imperial authority behind the creation of these theaters and the fact that people were required to sit according to their social rank, these theaters became a tool for the manifestation of the status quo, rather than something that could meaningfully deconstruct it. We do still hear about protests taking place in the theater, but now they're about the people refining their relationship with the emperor rather than questioning a system of government altogether. And actually, the relationship between tyrants and theater could be its own video, so if you have any interest in that, please let me know in the comments. Please consider subscribing or liking the video, or maybe sharing it with a friend or two. All of you could watch it together. Maybe you could sit together as you watch it. Maybe you start talking to each other. Who knows what happens then?